Methodist Church. Take your Bibles and open up about the middle of the Bible to Proverbs chapter 2. This is the second in a series of 2 messages that I get to preach on what I want to preach on, instead of what the Lord dictates. Hopefully, this is still from the Lord. Some of you are shocked, going, I can't believe he said that. I can't believe I did either. Part of not being wise. That's what this chapter is about. It's about wisdom, and it's one of my favorite chapters, along with the story that we looked at last week of Jacob, in which he says, everything against me, when you as a reader know that that's the furthest thing from the truth, that everything was actually for him. He just couldn't see it from God's perspective. And so this is another one of my favorite texts, because it reminds me that wisdom is not something that you just go, God, give me wisdom, and there it is. It's something that needs to be pursued at viciously, tenaciously, aggressively. Because of our fallen nature, we are at the very core of our being at enmity, or we're against the wisdom that God has for us. And so we have to fight tooth and nail in order to die to our own agenda and our own self, in order to really hear wisdom or really follow wisdom. This is going to come across in the text that Mark Smith is going to read for you just in a couple seconds. It's set up in an if-then statement. The first 4 verses saying if you do these things. Then in verse 5 it finally says, then you'll have testing 1, 2, 3. Then you'll have understanding, then you'll have wisdom. Not until. Listen very, very carefully as Mark Smith comes and reads from Proverbs chapter 2, and we'll talk about it after he's done.
Please stand. Proverbs chapter 2. My son, if you accept my words and store up my commands within you, turning your ear to wisdom and applying your heart to understanding, and if you call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding, and if you look for it as for silver and search for it as for hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom, and from his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He holds victory in store for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in blameless. For he guards the course of the just and protects the way of his faithful ones. Then you will understand what is right and just and fair, every good path. For wisdom will enter your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Discretion will protect you, and understanding will guard you. Wisdom will save you from the ways of wicked men, from men whose words are perverse, who leave the straight paths to walk in dark ways, who delight in doing wrong and rejoice in the perverseness of evil, whose paths are crooked and who are devious in their ways. It will save you also from the adulteress, from the wayward wife with her seductive words, who has left the partner of her youth and ignored the covenant she made before God. For her house leads down to death, and her paths to the spirit of the dead. None who go to her return or attain the paths of life. Thus you will walk in the ways of good men and keep to the paths of the righteous. For the upright will live in the land, and the blameless will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the unfaithful will be torn from it.
This is God's word. This is God's word. You may be seated. I don't know how much you know about big business, but it takes wisdom in order to be able to keep big business, big corporations running smoothly. There's actually people who are paid really, really big bucks to walk into big industry like General Electric and Boeing and General Motors and Ford, and walk into there and find out what's wrong with the whole corporation as a whole and fix it. In fact, there was one guy that I read a couple of his books. They were actually required reading in seminary. Read a couple of his books in seminary that was paid at that time in the early 90s $1 million a week to go in and do this analysis. Wouldn't you love to have that job? You can. The wisdom that they had to be able to go into these major corporations where there's tens of thousands of employees and be able to figure out the problem was all from Scripture. He just applied biblical wisdom to major corporations and was able to solve their problems. In fact, he has a really interesting statement that I will never forget. When you go into a big corporation, you're trying to find the problem, look for the ego. That'll alert you where the problem is. It's really interesting to see the thousands of heads that are going, thousands, obviously, that's an exaggeration, but folks, it's really not rocket science how to live wisely if we can just get beyond ourselves. The problem is us. We don't want to accept God's ways. We don't want to accept His wisdom because it's so counterintuitive. It's so counter against our own pride and our own egos that we don't want to submit to it, when in reality the God of the universe says this is the best possible life you can enjoy if you'll just do this. We had a living example of that here in this church this week. I don't know how many of you are on the prayer chain, but you received a prayer chain message on Wednesday to pray for Jim Fuller. And I have his permission to use this, to pray for Jim Fuller, because he was going down to Madison, Indiana to work with a corporation down there in which it had turned very ugly. He shared with me a little bit this morning how bad it had actually gotten. There was fights on the floor. Management was not intervening. In fact, they had pretty much surrendered and had isolated themselves in their offices and had surrendered the work floor to the workers. The workers were no longer observing the safety codes and no longer observing the OSHA rules. There are actually fatalities on the work floor because it had gotten so out of hand. One worker that Jim had to confront right off the bat, had long hair that was going to be easily entangled in the machine, didn't have a hard hat on, was actually eating spaghetti on the work floor, all of these which were no-no. And Jim said, listen, guy, you can't do this. And the worker took offense and chest bumped Jim as if to intimidate him. Now, Jim is very strong. I think he bench presses 350 or 400. It's a lot. In other words, you don't want to mess around with Jim. Isn't that the word from the song? Yeah. It applies. But this guy was egging Jim on, and Jim was sent there by corporate in order to fix this problem, okay? And found out real quickly where the problem was. And Jim is an amazing guy. He loves to apply biblical principles to all of his life. So he applied Proverbs 15:1. You all know what that is, right? A soft answer turns away wrath. So he gently dealt with this guy who was looking for a fight and told him, listen, I'm not here to pester you. I want you alive at the end of the shift. And if you continue to do these kind of practices, you're going to end up in great danger. There's actually a machine that Jim actually was part of the rescue. A machine that, I think he told me, cuts metal bars 1,000 cuts a minute. And a guy had a piece that was in there and reached in. You guys know what's going on, right? They actually had a tool that was supposed to lift it up and bring it out so you didn't have to. Okay, some of you who work on the floor, you know about this. But he actually reached in, and the machine runs so fast, it actually sucked him in. And he didn't realize what has happened. And they're still not sure why, but the machine refused to cut. It kept coming like this and just refused to cut. And the guy is sitting there like this, knowing that if this machine actually does what it's supposed to do, he's going to lose his hand. He screams, and Jim and some other people come and unhook the machine, and they say, listen, These rules were given to you for a reason so your hand isn't cut off. Don't do this. And by the end of 2 weeks, the whole plant had been transformed. The guy that was looking to pick a fight is now a leader and has the respect of everybody on the plant floor. And actually bought Jim a present before he left because he's so grateful for the transformation that's taken place. How is Jim and the people involved able to do that? They have wisdom. They applied God's laws, God's principles to their work floor and transformed it in just 2 weeks. And if you could have understood the violence and the lawlessness, the lack of authority, the lack of chain of command, all of those things just 2 weeks ago, and the huge transformation that took place, you would say what Jim is saying, it's a miracle. God did a work here. Like he told the guy with this cutoff saw, it's a miracle that you have your hand. Like he told the guy with the long hair, it's a miracle you still got your scalp. As a result, several people in management have become Christians because they've seen the transformation that has taken place not only in the Madison plant, but also in the plant here in Hillsdale County, in which Jim's a part of as well. Jim is actually probably the best evangelist we have right now. And what is he doing? Just being wise. Just applying God's principles. He's not looking to become an evangelist. He's not looking to do anything other than just do his job. God, that's so cool. Talk to Jim Fuller. He'll tell you a whole lot more, and it's a lot cooler story than I can tell you. Okay, the question before the house. If you want to follow along in the sermon online, I would encourage you to do that. We have lots of blanky things. You better have a good ink pen. Questions to be answered to this. What does it mean to be wise? What difference does it make if one is wise or not? And why is it so hard to be wise? I believe the answers are these. To be wise is to always regard God. No matter what situation you're in, you do it God's way. You listen to God's voice. You apply God's principles. You obey God's voice. You do what he asks you to do in every situation. Our fallen nature, left with pride, arrogance, and rebellion against God, serve to make us fools instead of, I forgot the second sentence. Wisdom leads to the best quality of life possible on a fallen planet. Our fallen nature left us with pride, arrogance, and rebellion against God, which serve to make us fools instead of wise. There's a great sermon that I listened to by Tim Keller called Wise Relationships. And in that sermon, he says that to be wise is to follow after God because to be foolish is to disregard God. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. And I'm amazed at how many of you know that. I said that in the first service, and they chanted back in responsive reading and went, whoa, and you guys did the same thing. You all know that. So to live in disregard to God, to live as if there is no God, is to be foolish. I don't want you to be foolish. God doesn't want you to be foolish, and you don't want to be foolish because when you're foolish, you pay the price for it. You live with all sorts of grief. Word for the day is wise. God wants us to be wise, and we have to regard God and his principles in order to live in wisdom. I have 3 points with several subpoints, so start writing. 1A. What does it mean to be wise? It means to regard God. Jesus said this actually at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. He said this, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the wind blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the wind blew against it and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. Now, you may be thinking, well, Pastor Keith, to be wise is to regard God, but you just told us to regard the words of Jesus. There's no difference. As we begin the book of Hebrews next Sunday, Hebrews starts out with the first 4 verses pounding in us that Jesus is exactly God. Jesus is the earthly representation of God. Jesus is God. John does the same thing in the opening 18 verses of his gospel, according to John. And Jesus is telling us, if you want your house built on the rock, you need to listen to these words of mine and put them into practice. What's really, really interesting is that Solomon was regarded as the wisest man on the planet for at least a period of time until he got older. Then he drifted. Caught his eye on about 1,000 women, which will get anybody in trouble. And that led him astray. But during the time of Solomon's peak of wisdom, he had a right relationship with God. He had a right relationship with everything else. And he was able to be wise because he understood the connection between everything. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Number 1B. What does it mean to be wise? It means to reckon with your mortality. Realize you are going to die. You will never truly live until you face your own death. One of my favorite, if you've ever been to one of my funerals, you know I read from Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 2 through 4. They are absolutely wonderful words that for about 30 years of my life, I had no clue what they meant. Then just before, actually it was in the middle of a funeral service. It must have been 15 years ago now. In the middle of a funeral service, I had done Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 2 through 4 for my morning devotions. Still clueless what it meant. I went and did the service, and in the middle of the service went, oh! And then people went, I think Pastor Keith just got saved. He's had a change of countenance right in the middle of the service. Because it dawned on me. Look what it says. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 2 through 4. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting. For death is the destiny of every man. The living should take this to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, because a sad face is good for the heart. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure. Solomon is telling us you're a lot better off and you're a lot wiser to go to a funeral than to go to a party. And in the middle of that funeral service, I understood why, because as I looked at the congregation while I was doing that funeral, I realized, what are they doing? They're taking inventory of their life. They're thinking, what's this pastor going to tell this congregation when I'm in that casket? What are they going to say about me when I'm dead? Will my life count for anything? Will anybody even cry when I'm dead? You don't do that at a party. At a party, you're just thinking about having a good time. Solomon's exactly right. To be at a funeral is a lot wiser. To regard your death is a lot wiser than to regard your pleasure. What does it mean to be wise? To reckon with your mortality. 1C. What does it mean to be wise? To humbly listen. Humbly listen. If you read the Old Testament especially, but also in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament especially, beginning with the book of Exodus and going through the book of Malachi, which is pretty much most of the Old Testament, over and over and over again, especially during the narratives, God will tell the people of Israel, I tried to tell you this, but you wouldn't listen. The prophets tried to tell you this, but you wouldn't listen. I tried to tell your king this, but he wouldn't listen. I tried to tell the people this, but they wouldn't listen. Especially in the book of Exodus, especially in the book of Jeremiah, which is this sad, weeping book of Jeremiah's lamenting over the destruction and captivity of God's people because they would not listen. God tried to tell them. One of the really cool things about reading through the book of Proverbs on a regular basis is you realize that God's wisdom is not hiding. In fact, over and over, the book of Proverbs tells us that wisdom is shouting at us from the streets. It's trying to get our attention. Wisdom is screaming at us from ants. Wisdom is screaming at us from kings and from poor people and from rich people and from lions and from tigers and bears. Oh my, it's just everywhere that wisdom is screaming at us. But we walk around like this. We don't want to listen because it will impose upon us some values that we aren't comfortable with. Wisdom is shouting at us. Hey, Porter, wake up! Pay no attention to the broken. Humbly listen. And here's where I want to spend some time. 1D. What does it mean to be wise? To have a right relationship with all of creation. Wisdom is seeing yourself, your life, and the world from God's point of view. I like this quote by Tim Keller. If you look at your sermon outline, wisdom is the ability to see and build relationships. Wisdom is the ability to take disparate things and put them into a whole. I've talked to you often about how in Western civilization we are at a severe disadvantage at looking at the scriptures because we're taught in a Western format. We're taught English class and we go out of English class and we shut off our brain about English. Then we go into math class and we do math. And then we go out of math class, we shut off our brain about math class and we go into history. But folks, life doesn't come at us that way in categories. It's called an Aristotelian form of education, and it's got its advantages because you can focus very, very carefully on certain subjects. But life doesn't happen that way. Life happens as a whole. Math and science and history and physical education and geography and geology are all together. And we need to have the proper relationship with all of them to be wise. And part of our Western education is separating us from a lot of the world that's trying to get into our minds and help us to understand comprehensively what this world is like, but we're so focused. Have you ever met somebody who's he's a rocket scientist or a brain surgeon that can't balance their checkbook? Einstein couldn't drive a car. Let's see, it's 90 degrees. We need to look at life as a comprehensive whole if we want to be wise. And we need to understand the relationship. What's really, really fascinating, if you look and study the life of Solomon during his really wisdom-filled years or wise years, it's interesting to note what the people have to say about his wisdom. Remember when the Queen of Sheba came to be able to discover what Solomon was all about? Because she had heard this tale about this wise guy in Israel and wanted to find out if it was really true that Solomon was really wise. And then she got there. It says in 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 4 and 5, that this is what she said about Solomon. When the Queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon and the palace he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attending servants in their robes, his cupbearers, and the burnt offerings he made at the temple of the Lord, she was overwhelmed. What do people's robes have to do with wisdom? Everything. When you understand wisdom in a comprehensive way, everything matters. Everything has a relationship with everything, but we don't see it because we're not wise. My relationship with people affects my relationship with my work. My relationship with work definitely affects my relationship with my finances. My relationship with my finances affects my relationship with God. My relationship with God affects my relationship with nature. My relationship with nature affects my relationship with God and people and work. Everything in life is connected, but we're not wise enough to see it. Solomon was. That's why I remember listening one time, I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Mars Hill Audio, but Mars Hill Audio has about 6 times a year a CD worth of lectures, usually on a particular theme or something, that looks at contemporary culture and how Christians should address that contemporary culture. They're on like volume number 140 or something like that now. But I was able to get access to them at volume 33 when I was graduating from seminary. They made them available to us, and I've kept them up for the years. And I remember very distinctly an architect back in the end of the 1800s who felt that everything in the entire house had to have a symmetry about it in order for it to have harmony throughout the entire house. So this architect not only decorated the woodwork and the ceiling and the floors, but actually the curtains were in harmony with the woodwork and with the floors. The plates were in harmony with it. The cutlery was a design. Wouldn't you like to see that house? Just to get a feel once? I mean, we bought our cutlery because it's what we got for our wedding gift. It's worked in all of our houses. But that's utilitarianism. If we were really concerned about making our guests go, doesn't this feel... Have you ever walked into a room and just go, whoa, this feels nice? Because it's in harmony. Wisdom has been applied to that room. Have you ever walked into a room of people and it feels just right? Because wisdom has been applied to those relationships. Have you ever walked in a room and go, whoa, something's going on here? Wisdom was not applied to that situation. To have, what does wisdom mean? It means to have a right relationship with all of creation. With people, with God, with creation, with your pets, with your finances. Pets. About 16 eyelashes went up when I said pets. Actually, God has a lot to say about our right dealing with pets. And might I just say really quickly, when the care of your pet exceeds the care of your children, you are not in right relationship. Okay? It happened this first service too. I'll back away. Some of you take your pets very seriously. There's a right way to regard your pets and an abusive way to regard your pets. You need wisdom. Okay, here we go. 2a. What's the difference? What difference does it make if one is wise or not? We're blessed. Proverbs chapter 2, I had Mark read for this reason. Verses 7 through 12. The Lord holds victory in store for the upright. He is a shield for those whose walk is blameless, for he guards the path of the just and protects the way of the faithful ones. You will understand what is right and just and fair, every good path. For wisdom will enter your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Discretion will protect you, and understanding will guard you. Wisdom will save you. To be. What difference does it make if one is wise or not? We're saved from grief. Wisdom will save you from the wicked men, it says in verse 12. In verse 16, it will save you also from the adulteress. It'll save you from making stupid company policies that actually breed mistrust in your company. It'll save you from having policies that will actually serve to discourage morale. It'll save you in your relationships from having a hostile situation rather than a loving situation. We all need wisdom in order to have the best possible life. This week I was informed about a major company, and the CEO had handed down a policy that I'm still curious to see if they're really going to enact this or not. But apparently the CEO had determined in their company anything more of one person looking at another person for anything more than 5 seconds, I've seen heads shake their heads, yes, is going to be regarded as sexual harassment. So, I can't tell you how disturbed I was Saturday night coming to praise band practice. I looked at Pastor Dave in order to understand. Oh, wait, that's been 4.5. Then I looked to Jeanette to see what part she was. Oh, Mom, that's 4.5. I couldn't sleep last night. Did I go over 5 seconds? Oh. Ah! Wisdom is shouting at us, trying to get our attention. Follow my ways, not the ways of the world. The ways of the world lead to death. My ways are the ways of life. To see. What difference does it make if one is wise or not? We're empowered to help others. That's the reason why God wants us to be wise, so that we can change companies, like Jim Fuller changed his company and brought harmony and prosperity and productivity to his work floor by being able to apply Christian principles and Christian wisdom to his work floor. You can do the same thing in your households. You can do the same thing in your neighborhoods. You can do the same thing at your workplace. You can do the same thing in your schoolroom. You can do the same thing in your classroom. You can do the same thing in your dorm room. You can do the same thing in your state. You can do the same thing in your nation. But it takes believers who are convinced that God's wisdom is what needs to be applied to these situations and apply them, actually do what God is asking us to do, to regard God and His Word. Okay, point number 3. Why is obtaining wisdom so hard? A, we are prideful, arrogant, and fallen from God. We are not in harmony with the God of the universe. That's why it's hard to apply God's wisdom to our lives. I love this quote. I think it's in your sermon outline. To make room for wisdom, get rid of pride. Like the guy that was able to go into a corporation of tens of thousands of employees and find the problem. And they said, how do you diagnose so quickly? And he said, I look for the ego. And that is definitely true in churches. It is definitely true in households. It is definitely true in classrooms. I'm going to share with you a story that I've never shared with anybody other than those closest to me. I've taken a lot of classes over the course of my lifetime, and I won't even tell the name of the university that I took it from. But anyway, I was at a particular university within 2 hours a year that I was taking a class, a 1-week intensive class. So I was driving down every day, 2 hours. Boy, I'm going to tell where it is. I was driving 2 hours every day to this classroom, getting there by 8 o'clock in order to sit in class from 8 to 5, then driving back, doing the homework, getting revival, going back every day. I'm making this 4 hours a day trip, okay? To hear this professor, because he's a world-renowned professor that I've read a lot of his stuff, and I thought, wow, I'd love to take a class from this stuff. Back in that corner, and that's Scott, I have nothing against you, but you are sitting where he sat. I sat right here because I was wanting to suck up everything this prof had to say. And I was hanging on every word. But back there, if killing was legal, he would have never made it through the class. because at least 3 times an hour, he would dominate the conversation so that 25 to 40% of the classroom time was him talking and not the professor. And I was getting madder as the week went on. The first day I thought, yeah, he'll shut up. Somebody will talk to him and he'll shut up. It didn't happen. And by Thursday, I was just burning. I'm making this huge sacrifice. I've spent all this money for this class. I've done all the reading for this class. I got there early to get the prime seat for this class. I'm making all this sacrifice for this class, and he's not letting the prof talk.
I have a view on that.
Wisdom from above. He just liked to hear himself talk. You know, it says in Proverbs a lot. Why don't you be quiet? Where there are many words, sin abounds, is one of the Proverbs. There's another one that's in the Living Bible. It goes like this. During my college years, I read the book of Proverbs every day. In fact, on the first day of the month, I read chapter 1. Second day of the month, I read chapter 2. 31st day of the month, I read chapter 31. And I started all over again the next month and read through. So during my college career, I read the book of Proverbs 48 times. Okay? 48 times. And I read it from the Living Bible. And one of the passages in the Living Bible says something like this. If you are quiet, people might think you're wise. But if you open your mouth, you're going to remove all doubt. Ecclesiastes, I think it's chapter 5, says, when you come into worship, shut up. Now, when you're singing, don't shut up. That's your part where you're supposed to sing. But what is the writer of Ecclesiastes telling us? You're in the presence of God. What do you have to say? Be quiet. Let the prof talk. When you come to worship, be quiet. Let God speak. Our God is not silent. That'll come across very strongly next week as we begin the book of Hebrews. God speaks, but are you listening? Why is wisdom so hard to attain? We're prideful. We think we know it all. 3b. Why is wisdom hard to attain? Wisdom is counterintuitive from the world. If you follow God's commands, the world would think you are an idiot. Quote in your sermon outline from Leon Morris, if anyone is to have true spiritual insight, he must become what the world calls a fool. True wisdom is found in renouncing the wisdom of this world. The Apostle Paul, in the letter to 1 Corinthians, spends from 1:16, I believe it is, all the way to chapter 3, the end of chapter 3, talking about the contrast between the wisdom of this world and the wisdom that God has to offer. 2.5 chapters the Apostle Paul dedicates to trying to get the people of Corinth to understand there's a stark difference between the wisdom of the world and God's wisdom. And in fact, if you follow the wisdom of the world, you cannot be wise in God's eyes. And if you're following God's wisdom, you're going to be called a fool in the world. But the wisdom of this world leads to death. And that's what we need to understand. I really appreciate this next quote from C.S. Lewis. If you want to read along, just follow along with me. For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem of human life was how to conform the soul to objective reality, and the solution was wisdom, self-discipline, and virtue. But get this. For the modern man, the cardinal problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of man, and the solution is a technique. I am seeing that everywhere. And folks, can I warn you? It is definitely prevalent in the church. We have failed to understand that God is God, and the only way a church really works is if we submit to the God of the universe, we submit to the Spirit of God who makes things work. Jesus said, apart from me, you can do nothing. And yet I have seen church after church after church promote technique. Well, if you do this, and if you do this, and if you do this, you'll have success. I heard it again this last week. A guy told me, if you do this, and if you do this, and if you do this, you can have a revival. Like the Spirit of God is on some leash, and if we put our prayer quarters in the certain slots and push the button and yank the leash, the Spirit will go, here I am. Ah! God is God, and He will do things as He chooses and as He wills. We pray to beat the band, we submit ourselves to the authority of God, and we earnestly desire, I can't think of the word right now, implore upon Him, please God, bring a revival. Please God, help our church to be healthy. But if He chooses not to, we're dead in the water. And I have an allergic reaction to churches that promote technique, and to any leader that promotes a technique that's purely from the world. Well, that's what your pastor thinks. Let's go on. 3C. Why is obtaining wisdom so hard? It is from God. Wisdom is from God. And we're God's natural enemies. Pastor Keith, you can't be serious. I'm dead serious. You were born a natural enemy of God. Romans chapter 3, Jeremiah 17:9, several passages in Psalms, all clearly tell us that Romans chapter 5 states, while we were enemies of God, Christ died for us. The only thing that will change our heart is to have the Spirit of God come in, and we accept Christ as our Savior to come in and transform our hearts so that we're no longer an enemy to God, but we want to be a friend of God. But folks, the tendency is still there, and if you don't fight tooth and nail to go against that natural tendency to be an enemy of God, you will be. I'm willing to say this. If you're not fighting tooth and nail for wisdom, if you're not fighting tooth and nail to have the Spirit of God, you've already surrendered and you cannot be wise. And if you think, well, Pastor Keith, you don't fight for your spiritual health like that. Talk to my wife. She'll tell you. Pastor Keith has big problems. Want to hear about them? You wouldn't do that to me, would you? No. I fight like everybody fights. It's spiritual warfare. To try to keep the right perspective, to try to keep where my heart is regarding God and not defaulting to my own way, to my own sinful inclinations. It's from God that wisdom comes. And if we lack wisdom, we should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. Worship point is this: God is all wise. When you know God, it is easy to worship God because everything He is, everything He says, everything He does is righteous, holy, beneficial, and good. The reason why our worship is so pathetic is because we really don't know God. That's why I'm doing the book of Hebrews next. We're going to spend about 8 months doing the book of Hebrews, and it's my prayer that not only will your pastor have a better understanding of who Christ is, but that you'll have a better understanding of who Christ is, and all of our worship will be much more intense. All of our worship will be much more authentic, much more genuine, because we've discovered how awesome Jesus is. Gospel application. It is only in Christ that we are allowed access to the God of the universe so that we too might become wise. The Apostle Paul says this in a couple places. I'm going to give you a verse by John MacArthur that gives you those locations. But John MacArthur says this. It's in your sermon outline. There can be no wisdom from above apart from a saving relationship to Jesus Christ, who is himself the power of God and the wisdom of God, and who brings sinners into eternal communion with God. 1 Corinthians 1:24 and Colossians 2:3. I would encourage you to look those up if you don't believe that Jesus is the only way we can have wisdom from God. Spiritual challenge, seek wisdom. I know the thrill of finding morels. I don't get out as much as I want to look for them, but man, my heart just jumps. My wife and I don't care if it's that big. We cut it in two and share. And then we put a little bit of butter in the little pan and we fry it up, and both of our mouths are drooling the whole time we're looking at this morel mushroom. And then we each, you think we're sick, don't you? We have a right relationship with morels. We really appreciate God's creation. And then we savor that taste. But folks, our pursuing morels should be a drop into the ocean of our pursuit of God and his wisdom. And it doesn't come by spending 3 minutes a day reading one Bible verse. I've done 2 major projects in my property to revitalize it. Both of them involve stones. One, my previous owner had made a pad for his boat or something, and it had about this deep of stones in it, intermixed with dirt, where I think he put his boat or something anyway. But I wanted to make it into a flower bed, but I didn't want to lose the dirt. So I made this grid of screen and box so I could run all the stones through it, get the dirt to fall out on the other side, and then throw the stones away. And now it's a wonderful flower box. In fact, that dirt is really, really good dirt. Anyway, it took an entire summer to do a spot about 10 by 30. Whole summer. Every free minute that I had, I was out there pouring rocks through this grid and sifting it through and carrying them off. And then recently this summer, I had a similar project, although I don't have a similar reaction. My shoulders have become very, very sore. Why would I do that? Because I was seeking to have a nice garden. Do we really want to seek after wisdom? Or is it just something we say, yeah, I'd like to have wisdom, and it won't cut it? I'm telling you, to seek after wisdom is going to involve everything in your life, because it involves everything in your life. There is not a single aspect of your life that wisdom should not be applied to in order for you to be truly wise. Seek wisdom as you would silver or gold. Ask God to give you wisdom and never give up seeking wisdom. Never, never, never. I appreciate this quote by Theodore Roosevelt in your sermon outline. 9/10 of wisdom consists in being wise in time. Listen, there are proverbs that are back to back. Answer a fool according to his wisdom, and you will be like him. Do not answer a fool according to his wisdom, or he will do something bad to you. I can't remember now what it says. Wait a minute. You just told me to answer a fool according to his wisdom. Then the next verse you told me not to answer a fool according to his wisdom. Which one is it? Depends what time it is. Do you remember Ecclesiastes chapter 3? When the writer of Ecclesiastes said, there's a time for everything under the sun. A time to be born, a time to die. Time to plant, time to reap. Time to kill, time to let live. Time to sow, time to rip apart. Wisdom is knowing what time it is. And folks, I can't tell you that. God can. That is why you need the Spirit of God working in your life to tell you what time it is in your life. So what? A wise person enjoys the best possible life on a fallen planet because he alone knows the reality behind the reality. He knows the truth behind the superficial. He knows the relationships this has with other realities. He knows the way God wants him to apply his life to this reality at this point in time. Not just a formula, well, law says this, law says this. I'm not going to go there now. We'll be way later than we already are. Let's pray. God help us.